What you're talking about is the same calculation as aging. And sadly, both of them are hitting us at the exact same time, where aging will naturally end up in an issue where you have a small young population working to support a large elderly population. And the young population will get intensely resentful about that, especially if you look at the boomers have done very financially well for their whole life. And so you're asking Zoomers who have basically been screwed over their whole lives to support the boomers' retirements. And so that's going to end up becoming a massive issue. And
oh, bro, they're going to say no.
yeah, exactly. And the Zoomers are going to have the military power too, because they'll be the people with the guns in the army. And so that's going to get ugly.
Well, I don't know if I agree.
Yeah.
Boomers are going to control the military because of their accumulation of base assets, right? So you take a look at like Venezuela. You're going to have a 25-year-old National Guardsman, and the boomer is going to say, we control the bank accounts, we control the flow of resources. If you want to feed your family, you're going to work for me. And they're going to say, okay. But you will have revolutionary.
In this intense debate, we're diving into a clash of generations and ideologies over a key issue, social scrutiny, and the growing generational wealth divide. This discussion unpacks the looming resentment between Gen Z and boomers, with both sides holding firm stances on who holds power and who should bear the financial burden. Gen Z's frustration with economic inequality and boomers' stronghold on wealth have set the stage for what might be a major confrontation. Let's dissect the insights and tensions in this debate and see which generation comes out on top.
Zoomers who are going to say, I am done doing labor for you. And that's when you get this impasse. Currently, I think the estimate is between 2.8 and 4 workers to cover the cost of one Social Security recipient. So as we have an aging population and a depopulation at the same time, this is another reason I think Democrats want to bring in as many illegal immigrants as possible to bolster the tax base.
Yeah.
Because if you get to that point, which they're estimating 2032, where Social Security becomes insolvent and they can only pay out what goes into it, there's going to be a lot of very angry boomers and older Gen Xers who are going to be saying, I paid into this. I deserve it. It's mine. And they're going to say, except due to the cost of living increase and inflation, you've paid into at 1 times and you need 2.8 to 4 times to pay you back. Now you're asking young people to do labor for you. There's no answer there.
Yeah.
The conflict becomes powerful elites who control structures and can influence and guarantee food and resources to younger people who fight and younger people who fight.
Yeah.
But on the automation, I actually have to give some defense of automation, because a lot of these jobs that are going to be replaced by automation, that's what we're bringing in the illegals and immigrants to do. I mean, I don't know about the local Taco Bell, but you can go to a lot of Taco Bells, even off the interstate in rural areas, and you'll see somebody who barely speaks English at that job. And you'd probably be, actually, I'd much rather have an AI kiosk to help me there. And that would also, a lot of these people, if they're like, they don't have a job, then they'll go back to Guatemala. So I think actually there are a lot of Americans who are hurt by this, but a lot of the Americans who are hurt are already on the welfare system as is. Now, there's some things that negative that would be impacted, but there's other things that would be positively impacted. Now, on the point of the economic problems, I mean, we've had several severe economic problems throughout our history. You know, throughout the 19th century, Panic of 1837, elsewhere, there was times where people had all their savings wiped out and they could no longer feed themselves. And this was even the case in the Great Depression. People were legitimately starving. The thing about America is that our poorest people are able to be obese, that they're eating too much. And they don't have to worry about food and water. Now, they do have to worry about where they're going to sleep at night and this, but they'll also even have iPhones and all these trinkets that, you know, the poor people who are literally starving in Africa could never dream of. And going to your point about the, you know, with the debt, individual people having debt and all these problems, and then civil war solving that. But
mentioning civil conflict here isn't just dramatic, it reflects real anxiety about the direction we're headed. Debt and stagnant wages, generational tensions are breeding resentment that can't be ignored. While it may sound extreme, this frustration isn't just posturing, it's a signal that people are fed up with the system they feel is failing them. If society doesn't address these economic disparities soon, it's going to see a level of unrest that can't just dismiss as a rhetoric.
That's on the individual level. An individual himself cannot start a civil war. It has to be a large group. And so if a large group, you know, it'd have to be like a state of something, you know, a sizable amount of people, millions of people who all have the same problem, and then saying, okay, this civil war, we're starting that. And generally, if you look at past conflicts, it's either that they feel that their rights are being denied, or that they would like independence for their spot of land, or that there was this grave insult that the majority population of the government paid to their culture of some sort. Then they would go along with it.
When we get to the level where more people have to pay into benefits and do work, when the majority is receiving these benefits, the system is inverted and it can't sustain itself. Then you're gonna find perhaps it's a simple economic collapse. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to go start fighting, but it does mean the system is shattered.
Yeah, it could be a collapse. I think a collapse is a better way of saying it, but we don't know what would happen afterwards. I mean, it'd probably be roving bands of gangs. It's like the Roman Empire with these war bands around. The fall of the Roman Empire is basically MS-13 and Hell's Angels and these gangs just fighting it out over the remnants.
The factor that I believe is on top of all of this is that with all of these issues we are describing, not one single one being a guarantee of civil war, you have to factor in that there are two distinct moral worldviews between the right and the left. And when these problems, when the system collapses, when there's an inversion, when you look at the willingness to engage in violence from the left already, then you basically have not one moment, but you have ingredients in a single cauldron.
This metaphor of a cauldron full of issues is spot on. We're in a precarious moment where economic hardship, ideological divides, and generational resentment are all coming together. This isn't just a phase, it's a ticking time bomb. If politicians continue to ignore these tensions, they're playing with fire. It's not enough to acknowledge the divide. Real action is needed to prevent this growing clash from spiraling into something far worse.
And which could be civil war. And again, that's why I'm saying I don't know that I agree. I don't agree that by April it's 1,000 dead people. That being said, the Summer of Love was something like 36 deaths, and that was a period of 4 days. Yeah. So if we get something like that sustained every 4 days, 30 plus deaths, I don't know. We're going to get to 1,000, but we'll certainly have hundreds.
A couple things. The first is we're acting as if the historic record doesn't exist, but the reality is the historic record's the only thing we actually have to study, and if you look at the historic record, war is completely normal. If you want to bet over someone's life whether or not there'll be a major war, you should always bet there's going to be a major war in every lifetime. And keep in mind, the bloodiest events in history all occurred within living memory.
If you're saying that by April there will be 1,000 dead, is it fair to say you're including the month of April in that equation?
Yes.
Like, let's say the end of April?
Yes.
If starting today we had a Summer of Love style level of violence and has to start today until the end of April, that would be 1,645 deaths. So if we were to cut that by a third and remove 2 months from the equation and start from the end of December, then Rudyard's estimate makes sense if we get Summer of Love level of violence in December.
1,000 deaths is also nothing. It's difficult to convey that point, but you look at war, and let's say there's a very basic supply chain breakdown. Even stuff like you can't get medical equipment for a few weeks. That's millions of deaths because of millions of people are reliant upon very complex medical systems. If the port of Los Angeles gets blockaded for a few weeks,
that's blockading it.
So
let me finish the point.
I'm sorry, I got to pause you.
Yeah.
I did the math.
Yeah.
I asked ChatGPT if we were trying to, I said, assuming that the end of April is the end of this calculation,
yeah,
on what day would violence have to begin in order to reach 1,000 deaths by April? And do you know what that date was? January 6th, 2025.
Let's see what
this prediction hits hard, tying future violence to January 6th, a date already marked by division, and it's not just speculation, it's warning. If we keep ignoring the issues tearing at our society, we're on track to see history repeat itself in an even uglier way. These kinds of forecasts aren't just theories, they reflect the real dangerous path we're on and headed down unless serious changes are made.
Fates say.
Yeah, what? Yeah, that I did not see coming.
We might have a prophet here.
I mean, the way war works is, and we're acting as if the world is mathematical and reasonable and rational, and the world really isn't. World War I, there were no deaths, and then 500,000 men died in a few hours. And if there's a war, and we forget how big population numbers are, we could easily have 20 million deaths because you starve out certain cities, you bomb certain areas. people keep in mind the part of Germany where my ancestors were from in the 30 Years' War, 80% of their population died. Stuff like that's not unreasonable because supply chains are so interdependent and complex. You could very easily have cities starve. People would have no food. They'd have no idea how to forage. Medical equipment's incredibly a lot of people have medical conditions that require very complex supply chains. It's very easy to have lots of people die. And you look at the world wars, again, in living memory, 40 million people died in the Eastern Front. I don't think things will get that ugly, but 1,000 deaths is nothing. That's like a single charge for a single front of infantry in a battle. That's 1,000 deaths in a handful of hours, or even you could have 1,000 deaths, a single front of a battle in a half an hour period. This is what the world wars were.
These cities throughout the country in 67, 68 were basically going under an insurrection. And hundreds were dying. I think, like 100 died in Detroit and New York. So if you do have that situations, you could have that. But even in our mass riots we had in 2020, where we had 36 die, but there were far more riots and it was everywhere.
Reflecting on the 2020 riots and comparing them to past unrest is a warning that today's tensions are far more widespread and ingrained. The repeated economic struggles and cultural divides make for a much more volatile environment now. We're not just dealing with isolated instances. Their unrest is nationwide. If the underlying issues continue to be unchecked, the level of civil disobedience we saw in 2020 may just be the beginning of something far more intense.
It was still very bad. I'm not trying to downplay the summer of 2020, but it was less bad than what it was in 68, where, the type of violence that was being able to commit was more even back then. Now, this could change. Maybe this happens after the election in 2024, but who would be committing this violence? And the people who would be most worked up about the election, say if Trump wins, would be middle-aged cat ladies. It would not be the urban population that you need that were waging this insurrection back in the late 60s. And even now when people go up, and there's enough man on the street interviews with local blacks in Chicago and Detroit, and they're like, yeah, I like Trump. They're like, I don't know if those people are going to be rioting.
But that's not real.
Their votes aren't real, but I just don't think that they're not that angry about
these
Trump.
videos are not including the Kamala voters. They're intentionally asking 10 people and then showing the 5 Trump voters.
I think the majority of those areas are 100% going for Kamala. And a lot of those guys who are saying they're voting for Trump, their ballot has already been cast for Kamala. But I'm just saying that they don't seem that upset by Trump. That's my main
right. But understand, you're talking about selectively edited videos to make a point where, and I've talked about, there was one recently that went viral where it's a guy working at a gas station and he asked the young black men coming in, who are you voting for? And you can see in the background, there are other people, but for some reason never appear in his video because he's showing the Trump supporters. And it's fine if you want to say, look at these black men I met who want to support Trump, but they're not including the Harris voters, which is the overwhelming majority in those areas. Additionally, just because there are cat ladies who overwhelmingly vote in one direction doesn't mean it's reasonable to assume they'd be the ones fighting.
Well, they were the ones that were protested immediately after Trump
that's meaningless.
won in 2016.
What matters is control of assets and the means to control a young person who is capable or willing to fight. Then there's also, if you live in, this is interesting. When you look at that movie Civil War that came out earlier in the year, the map they drew shows West Virginia as part of the federal apparatus. Well, that makes sense, right? Why would West Virginia? Because West Virginia is territorially locked and would be conquered in 2 seconds. Now, to be fair, West Virginia probably would not be conquered in 2 seconds because it's mountainous and very hard to move through and gain control of. But because of its proximity to D.C., it's going to be left. It's going to be Democrat. West Virginia is the second most Trump-supporting state in the country, but it's going to be one of the first moves made by federal authorities in the event of any kind of state dispute. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm saying that's why the movie predicted West Virginia would be aligned with Virginia and Maryland because of proximity. So my point there is cat ladies are going to sit there and complain, and then they're going to vote, and the politicians are going to say, these are the allocation of resources. Then there's going to be a bunch of Zoomers who are like, look, man, I'm in the National Guard and I live in Maryland and they're ordering me to do this.
I'd love to hear your guys' opinion down in the comments below. I always like to hear other people's perspectives and opinions based off what was said here. If you could give us a like and subscribe, really helps out the channel, and we'll see you guys in the next one.